75 years. For 75 long years, I believed I was clinging to my roots as firmly as a leaf clings to its branch, nourished by the blood of the blessed people who raised me. That was until, in the dust of the attic, at the very bottom of my mother's old hope chest, I found a faded letter, one that revealed I was not a tree with deep roots, but a rootless sapling, and that my whole life had been nothing more than a tender lie, carefully woven with love.
Since the day my dear Hassan passed away, my greatest companion had been sitting in that old, creaking armchair by the window, watching the world outside and breathing in the scent of rain as it mingled with the earth, for every drop seemed to whisper memories of our happier days together, of those gentle conversations as we watered the roses in our garden into the ears of my weary, broken heart. And so it was on another of those rain-soaked days, when a heavy gloom pressed upon my chest, that I persuaded myself, under the pretext of searching for the tiny knitted booties I had put aside for my granddaughter Elif's soon-to-arrive baby, to climb into the dusty loft I had not set foot in for years. Yet deep within me, I knew that what I truly sought was not a pair of booties, but the sweet comfort of the past, to feel once more the presence of my mother and father among the things that still bore their scent. When I lifted the heavy lid of the chest, the sharp scent of mothballs filled my nose, and beneath the neatly folded silk quilts my mother had so carefully preserved, and the proud military photographs of my father, I noticed, carefully hidden away and never before seen by me, a small carved wooden box. In that instant, my heart seemed to forget how to beat as my trembling hands closed around that little box of secrets. I felt I was not simply holding a piece of walnut wood, but cradling the unbearable weight of a truth that could shake everything I had ever believed, a truth so immense that life would never, ever be the same again. My mind rang with the ominous whisper of that inner voice, telling me that all the truths and memories I held would soon come crashing down, with the fear of one prizing open an ancient tomb, and a curiosity I could not restrain. I pressed against the cold resistance of the wood and slowly lifted the lid upon a darkness that threatened to swallow my future. The first thing my eyes fell upon was a single hand-knitted baby's bootie, its colors long faded by the cruelty of time, and yet clearly once belonging to a tiny foot that had never been part of the family history I thought I knew. At once, countless questions for which I had no answers began to crowd my mind. Still reeling from that discovery, I lifted a yellow-housed photograph from the box and gazed into the eyes of a woman whose face I could not recall from even the deepest corners of my memory. Her eyes spoke of a grief so profound that I felt it pierce me, and I could not fathom why her likeness lay hidden among my mother's most treasured belongings. And then, beneath that stranger's image, I found a sealed envelope addressed in the familiar, wavering hand of the woman who had raised me, my dear mother, marked with the words, "To my beloved daughter, Rukiye." In that moment, I understood that whatever was written within would become the heaviest burden I would carry for the rest of my days. Time itself seemed to halt. I stood at a crossroads. On one side, the comforting but false darkness of a 75-year lie. On the other, the merciless light of truth, a light that would wound me forever, yet shine with an honesty no lie could ever offer. Alone, I faced a choice that could never truly be made.
In that moment, It was as though every sound in the universe had fallen silent. Only the rhythm of the rain upon the roof above the attic and the thunder of my heart echoing through the fingers clutching that fragile paper remained. For I knew that each word I was about to read would shatter beyond repair the memories, the identity, and the roots I had cherished for 75 long years. The instant my eyes met the familiar, tender hand of my mother, spelling out the words, "You are not of our blood, my daughter, but of our soul," the wooden floor seemed to vanish beneath me. I was cast adrift into an abyss where I no longer knew who I was, where my memories were false, and even my joys and sorrows rested upon the foundation of another's life. According to the letter, the sorrowful woman in the photograph, the mother who had given me life, Inci, had, in the cruel grip of poverty and despair, entrusted her most precious treasure, her very child, into the arms of another woman. Through her tears, she had given me away so that I might live. As I absorbed these words, a fierce compassion bloomed within me for her sacrifice, and alongside it, a desperate longing for a face I had never known. Part of me bled with the sting of betrayal, yet another part swelled with gratitude as I remembered how my mother Samiha and my father Ahmed had never once treated me as anything less than their own flesh and blood. They had toiled night and day to raise me with unwavering love and devotion. And so my soul was torn between the cold agony of betrayal and the warm embrace of thankfulness. The letter burned in my hands like a live coal, and within my mind the words, "a coastal town by the Aegean," resounded like a tolling bell. In that moment, I was no longer my mother's daughter Rukiye, nor my father's cherished child. I was a lost soul whose past had been erased within the lines of a letter, and whose future stretched before me as uncertain and restless as the waves of the Aegean self. As the faint light of the setting sun pierced the attic window, illuminating the drifting dust motes one by one, I sat motionless, as though rooted to the wooden floor. And though the birds outside sang of life carrying on undisturbed, I felt within me that time itself had frozen at the very instant I learned that bitter truth. With every step I took down the staircase I had walked all my life, it felt as though I were not returning to the home I knew, but entering a stranger's house, built of walls lined with memories that were no longer truly mine. For this house was no longer a sanctuary. It was the silent witness to a secret my beloved parents had carried for decades. When I looked upon those two smiling faces, those dear souls who had sheltered me beneath their wings all my life, what I felt was not anger nor bitterness, but a searing tenderness and sorrow at the thought of how they had borne such a terrible burden in silence. Only hours earlier, this home was a refuge. Now every clock's tick, every familiar piece of furniture seemed to mock me gently, whispering the great secret they had long known but never spoken. I felt utterly alone, orphaned within the very walls that had raised me. And in the ruins of my mind, a single phrase from my mother's letter began to flash like a lighthouse beam. A coastal town by the Aegean.
In that moment, I realized that my life had not begun within these walls, but in some far-off place where the sea crashes endlessly against the shore. Perhaps to write the ending of my story, I would first have to return to its very beginning.
Beneath the lace quilt lovingly stitched by the mother who raised me, I felt, for the very first time in my life, so utterly alone, so utterly estranged. My mind swung like a pendulum of pain, back and forth between the memories of a 75-year-old false past and the imagined face of the mother who bore me, yet whom I had never known. In the weary reflection staring back at me from the mirror, I searched, within the color of my eyes, in the age spots upon my hands, for some trace of the woman in that faded photograph, that sorrowful stranger who was my true mother, Inci. I longed to find within myself even the smallest fragment of her story, for I felt I could not know who I truly was until I knew to whom I bore resemblance. At my age, with no companion but my walking stick, the thought of wandering the streets of some coastal town, its whereabouts unknown to me, in pursuit of a past that may by now have already slipped from this world, filled my spirit at once with an irresistible curiosity and the icy grip of looming failure and disappointment. Yet when I realized that the last wish of the mother who raised me, that whispered plea for my forgiveness, was not merely a request for pardon, but also a prayer that I might find peace by learning the truth rather than being crushed beneath its weight, I understood. This journey would not be a betrayal of their love, but rather the greatest act of gratitude I could offer to the life and affection they had bestowed upon me. As the first light of dawn crept into my room, I felt the storm within me fall still. I knew then that I would no longer be like a brittle leaf blown aimlessly through the autumn of life. Instead, I resolved to dig deep into the earth in search of my true roots and to embark, though uncertain, upon the journey that now seemed not merely necessary but inevitable. Even the scent of the simple morning coffee I had brewed in the same way for years felt different that day, for it was no longer a mere ritual to wake the body, but a draught of courage to fortify a weary soul that had resolved to build anew atop the ruins of 75 years. To see the words upon those official papers, those very letters I had always believed were the foundations of my identity, and to know now that they were but the scaffolding of a beautiful lie, struck me like a cruel blow. I saw, with painful clarity, that the bedrock upon which I had built my entire life was nothing more than a fragile thread. In that moment, I whispered deep within my soul to my dear parents who had raised me, "This is no betrayal of your love. It is rather my attempt to complete the little girl you nurtured with such tenderness, to find the missing first page of my story and set it in its rightful place." Just before dialing the cold, impersonal number of the registry office, I paused. I knew that this step would be the beginning of a road from which there was no return, that the simple question I was about to ask of a stranger could swing open every door that had remained locked all these years. And when the voice on the other end answered, "How may I help you?" and I whispered with trembling breath, "I am searching for a birth record from 75 years ago," I understood that I was not merely seeking a document of the past, but searching for my own truth, waiting for me somewhere in that unknown coastal town by the restless edge of the sea.
to explain to that weary, indifferent voice on the other end of the line the storm raging within me, tiny fragment of hope I had unearthed beneath the wreckage of a lifetime, the unbearable weight of a secret held for 75 years, using words as ordinary and simple as if I were asking about a misplaced bill, was one of the hardest tests of my life. In that pause of silence from the other side, it felt as though my whole existence hung suspended upon that slender telephone wire, while I waited to learn whether my past might be found buried in dusty archives, each second stretched into an eternity, and I was a solitary woman swaying helplessly between hope and despair. When the clerk finally uttered the plain words, "A record does appear," they resounded in my ears with the weight of a court's verdict. I knew that the next word I heard would bring an end to the life I had known as Margaret and mark the beginning of a new life as the daughter of Inci. The moment the unfamiliar name Silverhaven crackled down the line, it became far more than just the name of a town I had never seen on any map. To me, it was the sacred soil of my roots, the place watered by my mother's tears, the place of my very first breath. When I put down the receiver, the vague dream of a seaside village described in my mother's letter had become something tangible, a destination, a fragile beacon drawing me irresistibly towards it, point where all the secrets of my life had begun. To see, on the cold glow of a computer screen, the name of a town I had never known existed, complete with a timetable and a fare that made it suddenly reachable, pressed upon my heart both the childlike excitement of an adventure I had never before tasted and the crushing responsibility of a journey from which there could be no return. Into that small suitcase, I tried to pack not only a few simple belongings, but also the lies to which I had devoted a lifetime, the false memories I was leaving behind, and the fragile truth I was setting out to find, the entire weight of my existence in a single case. As I bid farewell to the ghosts of love and memory embedded in every corner of this house, to the shadow of the old Margaret who had lived here in ignorance, I realized with a bitter pang that the price of chasing truth would be this home itself, a place to which I could never return with the same peace. On the eve of the most profound journey of my life, I found myself unable to share the truth with even my closest neighbor, covering it instead with this small, lonely lie of, "I'm going away for a few days to rest." That secrecy, that enforced solitude made me feel like a hidden heroine in the story of my own life. And that night, as I lay in bed with the silent witness of my small suitcase by the door and the ticket that with the dawn would carry me into the unknown, I knew with terrible clarity this step would either lead me to my roots and grant me peace, or leave me abandoned in the endless void of rootlessness forever. As the key turned in the lock, that plain metallic click rang in my ears like a gong, closing the final curtain on 75 years of life. In that moment, I knew that what I had left behind was not just a wooden door, but the innocent Margaret who had lived all those years without knowing the truth. Amidst the cheerful laughter of young holidaymakers, the anxious rush of families eager to be reunited, and the weary haste of those bound for work, I, an old woman traveling alone in search of the greatest secret of her life, felt like a ghost drifting unseen through the crowd. As the coach wheels began to turn, carrying me further and further away from everything I had ever known, each each passing street, each familiar building seemed to tear away a fragment of my memories, stripping me not only of my roots, but of my very identity, leaving me just another nameless passenger. When the suffocating concrete of the city finally gave way to air scented with salt and soil, and I breathed in the brisk wind of the English coast, I was seized by a strange, inexplicable familiarity. It was as though my blood had forgotten, but my soul still remembered, a melody whispering softly from long ago. And then it happened. The name I had first seen written in trembling ink upon a letter now confronted me boldly on a cold road sign. In that instant, the quiet patience I had carried through the journey gave way to a breathless fear and an unstoppable surge of excitement. For I was now within reach of the greatest reckoning of my life. When I stepped down from the coach and set foot on the soil of Silver Haven, I felt I was not merely ending a journey, but closing the story of the Margaret I had been, and beginning to write, with trembling and uncertain strokes, a new tale, rooted in the land where I truly belonged. The fairy tale calm of this small seaside town, its sharp tang of salt mingled with the scent of jasmine on the breeze, filled one side of me with indescribable peace. Yet the other side was pierced by the reminder that behind such tranquility might lie storms untold, a hidden tragedy that had been kept silent for 75 years. As I walked through its winding stone streets, the curious gazes that followed me seemed to recognize at once that I was not of this place. It was as though their eyes whispered, "The answers you seek are not here," weighing down my every step with doubt. In that moment, I realized the hardest part was not reaching Silver Haven, but finding how to break the silence of a town that had kept its secrets for 3/4 of a century, and deciding whom to ask, where, and how. While I drifted helplessly in this vast ocean of uncertainty, the modest sign of a guest house caught my eye. To me, it shone like a lighthouse to a sailor lost in a storm. And I understood that before I could anchor myself in the dark harbor of my past, I needed first to find a quiet refuge in the present. As I stepped into the little guest house, beneath the curious yet kindly gaze of the elderly landlady, and inhaled the innocent scent of linden tea brewed over a wood fire, I tried to look like nothing more than a weary traveler, yet deep inside I was weighing every word I might utter, like a spy guarding a dangerous secret. Gripping the cold iron of the small balcony rail, I was struck by the thought that my birth mother, Alice, might have once gazed upon this very sea 75 years ago, perhaps dreaming, perhaps weeping, and for the first time in this foreign place, I felt less alone, as though her memory rode upon the salt breeze to keep me company. As the sharp fragrance of sage rose from the warm cup in my hands, I knew that the innocent-sounding question forming on my lip, "Who are the oldest families in this town?" was in truth a stone dropped into the depths of a still lake, its ripples capable of stirring unknown things to the surface. When Mrs. Fletcher mentioned the late nurse Edith, the midwife who had once delivered nearly every child in the village, and added that her daughter still lived in the old quarter, my heart nearly stopped. For in that brief exchange, I felt I had been handed the first rope
lowering into the bottomless well of my search, the first glimmer of hope. That night, in the small guest house room at Silver Haven, my mind no longer wandered through vague imaginings of an unknown past or an unseen mother. I had a clear, tangible goal, not to seek the hands that had borne me into this world, but to knock on the door of the woman whose mother had been the very first to welcome me into it. As I lay awake, listening to the moonlit but restless waves of the English Channel, rehearsing over and over which words would be right, which might be wrong, for that unknown woman I would face the next morning, I could not surrender to sleep, for tomorrow might be the day I awoke from a slumber of 75 years. That morning, as I stood before the mirror to give myself a final look, I was not merely arranging my clothes, I was trying to ready my spirit. I resolved not to appear as a beggar, an accuser, or a weeping child, but simply as a weary yet dignified woman seeking the missing piece of her story. As my feet pressed upon the ancient cobblestones, passing between old cottages that leaned toward one another as though whispering secrets, I felt each step carrying me not only closer to Nurse Edith's daughter's house, but also nearer to the hidden streets of a childhood I had been denied, forgotten, or erased. And in that moment, under the piercing gaze of a woman trying to discern who I was and what I wanted, I fought to keep my voice steady as I asked for a simple address. I realized again that in the pursuit of secrets, every step must be taken with care, for even the most innocent question can arouse suspicion. Finally, as I stood before the plain green painted wooden door, I understood that it was not just the entrance to a house, but to my entire past, and the hand I raised to knock would touch not merely timber, but either the threshold of my greatest hope or the depths of my greatest disappointment. The three faint knocks that slipped from my fingertips and echoed through the century-old silence of that street were for me not merely a call at a door. They were my first trembling touch upon the locked gate of a past that had been hidden for 75 years, uncertain of what I would find, weighted equally with hope and dread. When the door opened and I met the weary yet curious eyes of the elderly woman who might well have been the daughter of the hands that first lifted me into this world, it felt as though I stood not only before a person, but before the living memory of this town, the guardian of my secret. Every word that left my lips I forced into a calm, ordinary tone, like a traveler politely seeking out an old neighbor, while inside I smothered the desperate cry of an orphaned child aching to shout, "Who was my mother?" When I spoke my father's name, the man who had raised me, and that fateful date, 75 years past, I saw for a fleeting instant a spark of recognition flicker in her eyes. That faint glimmer was the first light of hope in the endless darkness of my search, enough to keep me from collapsing on the spot. And so, when she drew back the door and said, "Come in," the step I took was not merely into a house smelling of mothballs and memories. It was into the very first room of my life story, the room I had never been told about, the beginning that had always been denied me. As I faced the black and white photographs staring down from the walls, I felt I was no longer just a guest. These faces, people who might once have spoken my mother's name, who might have walked the same streets with her, seemed to judge me as if I were somehow accountable to their history, unknowingly bound into their family's tale. Laying bare the greatest secret of my life, the lie of an entire existence, and a mother's agonizing sacrifice through a faded letter and a sorrowful photograph, I felt as though I had stripped my soul completely naked, offering it to the mercy of a stranger's memory. As the woman, Mrs. Edwards, looked at the photograph of my mother Alice, every twitch of her brow, every line that deepened on her face, I watched with the helplessness of a pupil awaiting the verdict of an examination. For I knew that a single word from her lips could either leave me rootless forever or finally plant me in the soil I had longed for. When at last she spoke of Alice, not merely as a face in a photograph, but as a woman of flesh and blood, of suffering and despair, who had once lived and breathed in this village while serving in the Grand Whitmore Manor, I felt my imagined love for her turn into a sharp and crushing grief. And then came the revelation that my unknown father had been a sailor, and that my mother had followed him to a great port city. When Mrs. Edwards pointed from her window to the crumbling silhouette of Whitmore Manor, I understood that my search did not end here in Silver Haven. It had split into two paths, one leading into the silent corridors of that manor, the other out across the storm-tossed sea to find the man who had given me half my blood.
As I left Mrs. Edwards' memory-laden house and walked once more through the dim streets of Silver Haven, I no longer felt a stranger in this town. Every cobblestone seemed to hold my mother Alice's footsteps, every corner to glisten with the trace of her fallen tears. I was not an outsider anymore. I was a lost piece, returning to the soil that had once carried her sorrow. Until now, I had sought only the faint image of my mother, but with the sudden appearance of this sailor father, I realized my story belonged not only to the land, but also to the restless sea. The simple question of who I was had grown more complicated, for I now had roots both in the earth beneath me and in the waves beyond the horizon. At that moment, I stood at a crossroads. Should I first pursue my mother's silent cry within the crumbling walls of the Whitmore Manor, where her youth and hopes had been imprisoned? Or should I follow the ghost of my unknown father into the great port city, with its clamorous harbors and crowds, where his story had vanished into the salt air? When I looked again at her faded photograph, at that expression of helplessness carried with dignity, I knew my first duty was not to chase the storm of a man I had never met, but to bow in reverence before the memories my mother had left behind. Before I set sail towards him, I must enter the house where she had worked as a servant, where her muffled dreams still echoed. That night, as I gazed from my window at the dark silhouette of the manor looming on the hill, I understood that when I stepped through its broken gates in the morning, I would not be entering a mere ruin. I would be walking into the wreckage of her unfulfilled dreams and into the secret chamber of my own forgotten beginning. With each step I took up the slope towards the manor, it was as though I climbed not only through the earth but through time itself. The sounds of the living town below fell away, replaced by the eerie whistle of the wind and the heavy beat of my anxious heart. I felt I was passing from the world of the living into a world of ghosts. When I finally entered the garden, once alive with music and laughter, but now smothered in weeds and silence, the Whitmore Manor appeared not as a house, but as a mausoleum, a grand tomb that had swallowed my mother's tender hopes and the life I had never begun. The moment the stench of damp and decay filled my lungs, I felt the cold terror she must have endured. Here, hidden in those walls, she had borne her pregnancy in secrecy, in fear, with no one to comfort her. The grandeur of the place had rotted, but her loneliness still lingered like a chill through every stone. When I left the fading splendor of the ballroom behind and descended into her true world, the cold stone kitchen floor, the narrow servants' quarters with their barred window, it was there I saw most vividly the narrow cage of her life and the vast dreams she must have dreamed while staring through that window at the distant sea. And when I laid my hand upon the damp wall and closed my eyes, I was no longer merely an old woman chasing a ghost. I was a daughter who had returned 75 years too late to the sacred yet cursed place where her mother had suffered, had hoped, and had chosen to bring me into the world to understand her and at last to bid her farewell.
As I left the ruins of Whitmore Manor, the prison of my mother Alice's sorrowful memories, I felt as though I had left a piece of my soul behind to keep her ghost company within those cold walls. My duty on this soil was done. I had repaid my debt as a daughter, and now, at last, I had the right to seek the missing, storm-tossed half of my story, my father. I tried to picture this sailor I had never seen, which ships he had boarded, which seas he had crossed, whether on some storm-ridden night he had thought more of my mother or of the endless waves. Watching the fishermen mend their net, I wondered if there was in my blood a single grain of salt left behind by him. I could not tell Mrs. Edwards, that wise and kind woman, the truth that I was about to search for a man whose very name I did not know, as if digging a well with a needle. So my words were weak, evasive. Yet when she said, "If it's old sailors you're after, you might try the Sailors' Arms near the docks in Liverpool," I realized that her casual remark had opened a real door of hope in my false tale. Those two words, scrawled on a scrap of paper, Sailors' Arms, were no longer just an address. They were a compass to keep me from losing myself in a vast and frightening city. The first whispered clue on the path to a faceless father hidden among millions. And so, leaving behind the quiet village of Silverhaven, which held my mother's painful but familiar past, I turned towards Liverpool, immense, unfamiliar, and brimming with the unknown. My father's world of storms and shadows. In that moment, I knew I was no longer chasing a memory, but a ghost, and that the hardest part of the journey had only just begun. After the human scale and stillness of Silverhaven,
the city struck me like a wave, its ruthless noise, the crush of bodies jostling my shoulders, the endless tide of strangers sweeping me along. My private secret felt unbearably small, almost absurd, against the indifferent chaos of this metropolis. When I stepped beneath the arch of the old market at the edge of the docks, it was as though I had entered not just a marketplace, but a living labyrinth, pulsing with centuries of laughter, grief, haste, and whispered secrets. Following the fragile thread of that address through its winding alleys, I feared the tavern I thought might have vanished long ago, swallowed by the dust of history. After the curious warmth of Silverhaven, the brusque indifference of the city cut me sharply, reminding me that in this vast world I was utterly alone, and that the weight of my secret was mine alone to bear. And then, slipping free from the deafening clamor of the market, I found myself in a quiet courtyard where time seemed to pause. There, in the shadowed corner, stood the old tavern, the Sailor's Arms, its walls scented faintly of salt and rum. For the first time, I felt I had found a tangible place where I might trace the ghostly outlines of my father, the first safe harbor in the stormy sea of my past.
When I stepped into that tavern, its walls blackened by the memories of countless ships and storms, and its air heavy with the smell of bitter coffee and sharp tobacco, I felt as though I had not just entered a room, but trespassed upon the innermost harbor of a closed, masculine world. As I walked between those weathered old men, each face etched with salt and sun, like pages torn from the history of the sea, every step carried not only my own weight, but also the unbearable burden of the 75-year-old question I had come to ask. And when, in that silence, I finally let slip the frail, trembling words, "Does anyone here remember the old days?" I knew it was no different from a castaway, crying out in the middle of the ocean for a ship whose very existence was uncertain. The indifferent grumbles that rose from the tables, the muttered voices warning me that the past was a bottomless well, made me feel my small hope of Liverpool had collapsed into ruin, just as the manor back in Silverhaven had. I began to fear that the ghost I sought had never existed at all. But just as despair was about to engulf me, a calm yet resonant voice from the dimmest corner answered my question. In that moment, I realized that the light of hope had not been extinguished after all. It had been burning quietly all along, like a lighthouse that had weathered every storm and refused to forget. And so, amid the low rumble of the tavern, I found myself as if alone on an island, sitting opposite the man whose eyes mirrored both the calm and the fury of the sea. As I placed my mother's sorrowful portrait into his rough, time-worn hands, I was not merely offering a photograph, but entrusting him with the secret of my rootless existence and its fragile beginnings. Watching Captain James study the picture, I saw on his face a profound sorrow, mingled with a faint ghostly smile dredged from the wreckage of memory. Before he spoke a single word, I knew I had dropped anchor at the right harbor, the right memory, and that my long and weary voyage was drawing near its end. And when at last his misted voice revealed that my father's name was William, Will to his friends, I learned that he was not just a phantom, but a young man who had once loved my mother passionately, who had written her verses and dreamed alongside her. For the first time in 75 years, the void of fatherlessness within me was filled with a name, with a flesh and blood identity. Yet the fragile joy of learning his name was shattered in an instant by the truth that followed, that Will, along with the ship the Starling, had been swallowed by the black waters of a raging sea. And so, the father I had found after 75 years, I lost in the very same breath, with all the pain of a second, final farewell. At that moment, when I realized that the storm which had raged across the Irish Sea 75 years ago had not only swallowed the Starling, but also my unborn childhood, the father dreams I never had, and the brief spark of hope my mother Mary once clung to, I felt a grief unlike any I had ever known, a mourning that was at once utterly new and yet as ancient as my own bones. And when Captain James pointed his trembling finger at the black and white photograph of a young man with a smile as bright as the sea, a man whose eyes I imagined as blue and boundless as the horizon, I saw my father's face for the first time. My heart was torn between the pain of never having known him and the bittersweet pride of realizing I had walked this world carrying a fragment of his blood. With my father's smiling face pressed into my palm and his tragic story pressed deep into my chest, I wandered through Liverpool's deafening crowds. The clamor of a million strangers suddenly felt hollow and meaningless, while I drifted alone inside the hushed, sorrowful world of my discovery, gazing out toward the endless sea, his unmarked, mighty grave. I felt no anger and no resentment. Instead, I was moved by a profound respect for his brief, tempestuous life and the fleeting but genuine love he had once shared with my mother. And as the sun sank in its final blaze, I brought together in my mind two faces, my father's bright, vanished smile, and my mother's sorrowful, steadfast gaze. In that merging, I understood that my search was over. What I had found was not a living family, but a finished story, tragic yet whole, and I was its only living witness, standing between the sea that had claimed my father and the land that had burdened my mother. I realized my final duty was not only to uncover their story, but also to unite these two wounded souls in the only way their child could, with a sacred, symbolic act of remembrance. On that second and final journey back to Silver Haven, there was no trembling curiosity, no fear as before. I was no longer a pilgrim to the unknown, but a messenger, carrying the ashes of my parents' unfinished love back to the soil where it belonged. In my hand, I held a smooth seashell, as though my father himself had sent it from his deep-water grave as a token, a fragment of his storm-tossed soul, to be laid upon the lonely earth where my mother had once wept. Beneath the shade of the ancient olive tree, between the ruined manor where my mother had served and the restless waters that had swallowed my father, I stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the sole witness and sole judge of their impossible love. And in that moment, when I joined my father's sea with my mother's soil, granting them in death the reunion denied them in life, the burden of 75 years lifted from my shoulders. I understood then that I was no longer haunted by their sorrowful ghosts, but free at last
to live out the remainder of my own story.
On that final bus ride back through the streets I had once called home, I felt no longer the hollow ache of not knowing where I came from, nor the cold wind of a fatherless life. For now, I was the daughter not only of the family who had raised me with love, but also of a sorrowful love story, a storm-tossed sea, and a patient, selfless land. I had once stepped through this door burdened by the weight of a lifetime's secret, bewildered by the question of who I truly was. And now, crossing that same threshold once more, I carried within me the completed yet sorrowful story of my mother and father, and with it the quiet peace that comes from finding not only one's roots, but one's very self. In that moment, as I placed the faces of the two souls who had brought me into the world alongside the blessed couple who had sheltered me under their wings, I realized for the first time in my life that my family was whole. No shadow of secrecy, no whisper of deceit lingered in my heart. Only the rich truth of a life woven from the love, sacrifice, and fate of 4 extraordinary souls. And when I held once more the tiny knitted booties that had first sent me upon this journey, I understood that sometimes, to open a clean page for the future, one must turn the dustiest, darkest pages of the past all the way to the end, without fear. And so, seated once more in my old chair, with all life's storms calmed, every secret laid bare and every fragment returned to its place, I no longer feared the ghost of yesterday nor the uncertainties of tomorrow. For at last, after 75 long years, I had returned home, to the quiet harbor of my own soul. I was and will always remain Rukiye,